Have you ever wondered how much you need to squat, how frequently you need to squat for the sport of weightlifting? Well, today we're going to take a look at a couple of different common frequencies and combinations of front squats and back squats and see which one might work best for you. So the first one is one front squat. There's no real reason to do this. You need to do a little bit more than this. One front squat for pretty much anyone outside a ranked beginner isn't very useful. One back squat. One back squat's slightly more useful if you're training super low frequency. If you're pretty new to the sport, one back squat could give you some benefit by the fact that it's going to be heavier than front squats. You're going to be getting a good range of motion. You're hopefully going to have a decent upright torso. You're going to get some benefit from this. One front squat, one back squat. Now this is where we start getting into a bit more meaningful squatting frequency, and you can take this one a lot further than you might think. We can for sure say that if you're a newer lifter within your first year, maybe your first 2 years, you can get a lot of productive work done with one front squat and one back squat per week. Now obviously the programming, the sets and reps of this would take a bit more extrapolation, but in general, one front squat, one back squat can take you quite a long way. You just need to focus on the quality of the front squat and then the quantity of that back squat. We want to make sure we're getting good depth on both of these. This is something that if you're training 3 times a week, maybe even 4 times a week, which has been done before, and you're only squatting twice, this can be sufficient and can take you probably up to those somewhat intermediate numbers. Certainly if you're a recreational weightlifter or an amateur lifter, you can take this quite far. The next one is one front squat and 2 back squats per week. For most of your career, for a lot of you watching this, this is going to be the sweet spot. This is going to be the most productive squatting frequency that you can do. 2 back squats really allows you to develop and push the back squat. Bigger back squat, in general, from what we see, really drags up the front squat. The quality of the front squat is something that needs to be practiced, and it's supported by technique, mobility, assistance work, of course. But if you want to make big, meaningful jumps in the front squat, getting your back squat higher is always going to be the more efficient and effective way of getting big jumps in the front squat. You could only front squat for a while, we'll get to that in a second, but in terms of pushing your front squat numbers, doing this by itself is going to make really slow incremental gains and eventually will be very hard to progress. In general, if you think about it like this, let's say your best front squat is 150 kilos. There's a good chance you can back squat 150 kilos for 5 to 10 reps, depending on what kind of lifter you are. You might be able to do this twice a week without a huge amount of hassle. This is a huge amount of more productive work for your leg strength and your upper body strength than just front squatting. The extra volume, that extra tonnage on the back squat is something that is incredibly useful for weightlifting. In weightlifting, if we're getting an upright torso and a deep squat, the difference between the impact on our weightlifting in a global sense, just our whole total, our whole ability to weightlifters, isn't going to see a huge distinction between if we're moving the same weight with a front or a back squat. The heavier weight in general is going to be more productive. Remember, I always say weightlifting is a speed, strength sport. The strength matters, the strength impacts the speed. So in general, 2 back squats, 1 front squat for most of your career is going to be one of the best ratios that you can do. It's going to be the most productive long term. It's going to be the ratio that you can reliably and meaningfully predict how long you'll be able to do this. You know, if you're going super high frequency, super high intensity, you're not going to be able to carry this on for a long time. And as we talked about recently, consistency is incredibly important. So if you can consistently do this, this is much more valuable. 2 front squats and 1 back squat. This is slightly less productive than the 1 front squat and 2 back squat ratio. However, there is certain uses that the 2 front squat and 1 back squat can have. If you're in a phase where you have sufficient leg strength to clean and jerk the number you want, but you're someone who you find that the slightly higher frequency of front squatting makes a meaningful difference to your clean and jerk, then this for a period of time, for a peaking phase or the second half of a peaking block can be really useful. So if you're someone who responds really well when your front squat is strong compared to when your front squat is weaker on your jerk, this might be a good option for you. For some lifters, this provides a lot of psychological confidence if they're coming into a competition. This method, we don't really push for those heavier weights With this method, what we're really looking for is front squats in relation to your clean and jerk. So we might say your best clean and jerk is 120 kilos. We might routinely front squat 120 to 135, maybe 140 kilos. We might do a couple of singles, a couple of doubles, but we're not going to push that volume. We're not going to go crazy with this volume on this kind of front squat. This is practice for the sport of weightlifting, and this extra front squatting can often make a big difference for your ability to jerk better weights, clean and jerk more consistently, and with better quality technique. This, however, isn't very useful long term, because at a certain stage we're going to need to push that back squat a little bit more, so eventually your front squat is going to run to a little bit of headway, and as a result this is a good peaking term, or something that if you're going for very heavy lifts can be useful for 6 to 8 weeks or so. 2 front squats and 2 back squats. This one is generally for later stage intermediate lifters all the way up to elite lifters. This is something that undoubtedly will be a very productive frequency for squatting if you have the time to train, if you're well trained, if you're genetically predisposed for weightlifting, you have the resources, you have the social resources, you have the financial time and the recovery capability to do a lot of weightlifting. This is something that for most recreational weightlifters can work, but isn't necessarily needed. Oftentimes the stature clean and jerk will suffer due to the location of resources to extra squatting when it's not necessarily needed. However, for lifters who are training 5 times a week or more, who are pushing maybe for, you're trying to win the American Open, you're trying to win French or German nationals, you're a good lifter, you're possibly not on a load of gear, you're possibly not on any gear, and you're trying to push for some very decent numbers, this can be really useful for the latter training blocks where we're not necessarily pushing for massive numbers. We might get some bigger back squat numbers out of this. We might get some front squat PBs, but this frequency of squatting is useful for maintaining the shape we need and the skill we need for weightlifting. 3 front squats and 1 back squat. This is quite similar to what, for example, Team Kazakhstan use. They back squat once a week and then they front squat 3+ times a week. So they're front squatting sometimes twice a day, sometimes front squatting 3 times a day. This, look, to be honest, is mostly requisitioned for people who are probably on PEDs. I say probably to maintain some form of political neutrality, but in reality, this isn't going to be very productive for anyone who's watching this, unless there's some very good weightlifters from Kazakhstan watching this. If that's the case, hello. But the real key here is that with these higher frequency front squats and this once per week back squat, is that the back squat might progress with the front squat, but your ability to front squat with this frequency in meaningful weights isn't going to be that high. You're just not going to be able to do a lot of heavy front squats, then do a lot of snatches and a lot of clean and jerks. And if this is 3+ frequency, 3+ times per week with the front squat coming onto the back squat, at the end of the week, it's not possibly going to be very good unless you save yourself for the back squats. This one, for you guys watching, almost pointless. It might be fun to try if you just want to do something just incredibly tough and just see how it goes, which there's cases for that. I've done that myself. But for the most part, this is something that I don't recommend you do. It's something we see some of these countries doing. It's not productive for most people watching this. Then we've got 3+ front squats per week. This is something that isn't really popular. We see this sometimes we see this with elite level lifters where they only do front squats. In recent years, we would have seen this with some Chinese lifters. But even in those cases, we had people like Li Dian, for example, we only saw front squatting, or you might see the vice versa. This isn't that productive unless you're already super strong and you're someone who is more than excessive leg strength, and even in that case the back squats would still be a more productive use of your resources. For anyone watching this, just front squatting multiple times per week isn't that productive. Now there's one missing from here, and this is actually 2 or 3+ times back squats per week. Again, on the same vein of this would be a little bit more productive, but again, you're running into this issue of how many resources do you have to commit to back squatting? How much can you really back squat meaningfully 3+ times a week? Or, you know, for a lot of people, if you're training 4 times a week, back squatting 3+ times a week, if you're back squatting 4 times a week, so every day you train, you're just not going to be able to get a meaningful amount of intensity done in these sessions. Your frequency will be quite decent, obviously, because you've got 4 sessions, but you also won't be able to do a meaningful amount of volume, so you try and split that volume out over the weeks. And so as a result, yeah, your legs will be staying strong, but you're obviously missing the key component that front squatting is still very useful. I know I said that back squats drive up the front squat a lot. But that doesn't mean that only back squatting or leaving out the front squat doesn't have value. Of course, the front squat is incredibly valuable. It's a sport-specific movement. It's very useful for cleans. It's very useful for jerks. But in that sense, the only back squatting also isn't ideal. However, you can get away with it. If you're an experienced lifter, if you've got good mobility, if you're clean and jerking pretty heavy weights and you have good technique, you could get away with just doing your clean and jerks and your back squats. Some lifters have favoured that in the past. For example, Stefan Botev, even though he has a 300 kilo front squat, he apparently liked to back squat a lot more, not do a huge amount of front squats. Whether that was true or not and what that actually looked like in training is something we can't definitively say. However, you can definitely do this if you're a very skilled lifter and you have a strong back, you've got a good back squat. You could get away with just back squatting only. Do I recommend it? Not really, but it is feasible should you want to do that. Lastly, then we've got squat every day or squat every day you're training. There is some lifters who do this. They'll squat all the time. These are usually remained for elite level lifters. The reason for the squat every day is that sometimes when we see weightlifters, they like to squat this frequently to facilitate the skill of weightlifting, to keep their legs in shape for weightlifting. So when they do this, they aren't necessarily trying to push their 1 rep max number, or rather they know this isn't the most productive way to push their 1 rep max number, but they know that this keeps them fresh for weightlifting. It keeps them in with the skill of weightlifting. A lot of times they'll do top sets and leave it there. They'll do a top single, or they'll do some moderate sets that are in relation to their clean and jerk. So they might back squat 100% of their clean and jerk, or 120%, which in general is quite low for them in terms of absolute weight. This is something that I don't recommend. We would never use with a lifter. Some lifters do use this. Even in those cases, I don't think it's the best idea. I think some sessions where you take a break from squatting is valuable, but there is some merits to that where they're staying fresh for weightlifting. Their legs are staying in shape. It's similar to any other sport-specific skill, except in this case, it's squatting with weights. That's the theory behind it. It does work to a certain extent. However, it does leave you open to a lot of overuse injuries. It does leave you open to having a bit of an impact potentially on your speed in weightlifting if you don't have the ability to recover from this frequency of squatting, even if you are, well resourced and well trained and well genetically predisposed for weightlifting. So the squat every day, we've covered this loads of times why it's not the best to improve your 1 rep max in terms of meaningful heavy weights. Not going to cover it today, but for some weightlifters, this is an option. For you guys watching, I don't think you should do this. I think this would be a key waste of your time. I think the real ones for you guys would be, a lot of you, 1 front squat, 1 back squat, get that quality in. This would be a good place to go. 1 front squat, 2 back squats. A lot of your career, this will benefit you a huge amount. Then some of you might need these 2 options. Then for the more advanced lifters, people pushing, 130 plus, 160 plus, there is times where that 2 front squat and 2 back squat will be a useful tack to your training. Not all year round, but will provide some merit. So if you have any questions on squatting frequency or squatting around weightlifting, leave them below. If you want more information like this, sign up to the Sika Strength weightlifting newsletter at sikastrength.com in the link below.